This is a 46 of 46 podcast, Campfire Story. The woods. Often a place of rejuvenation and a chance to reconnect with nature to fill that primal need within us all. Whether you're hiking on a trail, swimming in a lake, or just stopping to take in the scenery, the outdoors can be a tranquil place on a bluebird afternoon. But when the sun goes down, that same wilderness can become a place of pure, inexplicable fear. The woods are a very different place at night than they are during the day. The forest comes alive once the moon rises into the sky. Things awaken, wandering between the trees. That's why it's never wise to spend a night alone out there. You never know what's lurking behind your tent, only feet away from your head, with nothing separating you and them than a thin piece of fabric. For Joe, what was supposed to be a typical weekend camping and fishing deep into the Adirondack backcountry quickly turned into a night of unforgettable terror. It was a Thursday afternoon in late June as Joe prepped his kayak and his fishing poles for a long weekend of fishing and camping in the remote Siamese Pond wilderness in the southern Adirondacks. With the long 3-day weekend ahead, he wanted to spend it out in the woods he's explored ever since he was a little boy. With the busy holiday, of course, meant bigger crowds, so naturally his instincts took him deep, deep into the forest, where he wouldn't run into another soul. Plus, the fishing would be better back there anyways. Joe was planning to fly fish and catch some trout since they love to bite this time of year. He tied up his yellow kayak to the top of his green 1994 Jeep Wrangler with one red door. His car had seen better days, but it's also taken him all around the Adirondack Park for almost 15 years. A trusty vehicle. Joe left his house and drove 30 minutes southwest to his destination to launch for the weekend. He plans his backcountry expeditions meticulously, and he planned to paddle the north branch of the Sacandaga River, northeast of Speculator, a remote wilderness where he'd be sure to have the woods all to himself. Or so he thought. Joe arrived just after 1 p.m., put his kayak in the water, tied up his weekend supplies, fishing poles, tent, food, cooler, and he set off into the water. But not before leaving his cell phone in his car, of course. After all, what good is a cell phone when you're deep in the park without service anyways? Thanks to his planning and having been back into this area in the past, he knew the paddle would take him a good 3 to 4 hours to get to where he wanted to go. It was very secluded back there, kayaking through flat, calm areas, followed by short rapids, and then back to calm, peaceful waters. Just him and nature. The trip included various carries over rocks and even across a couple of beaver dams. And then around 4:30, he came to the area he wanted to spend the long weekend in and began looking for a good place to camp along the side of the river. Moments later, he found a small flat clearing and thought it was the perfect choice, so he paddled the 15 feet to his left, right to shore. The woods were thick back here, hard to see very far in between the trees, maybe 10, maybe 15 feet in some places, and no visibility in other places. He felt he was secure and wouldn't be bothered. The air was fresh with a scent of pine, coming from the pine forest towering above, with small thickets below. Exhausted from the long paddle, Joe was happy to arrive at his weekend destination and began to set up camp. He built his tent, a one-man blue tent that he spent many nights in over the years around the Adirondacks and elsewhere. Once his tent was built, he began gathering firewood for the night, collecting broken branches and logs all around his campsite, scraping some birch bark off the deadfall, and he piled it all right next to his tent. The sun was going down, and it was close to 9 o'clock by this point, as Joe had his modest campfire burning. It was time to eat dinner. He packed some hot dogs and rolls, nothing fancy, nice and simple. He found 2 perfect-sized sticks and roasted a couple hot dogs over the fire, 1 stick in each hand. The trip so far was going exactly to plan. After all, Joe spent a lifetime in these woods and didn't expect anything out of the ordinary to occur. But all of that would soon begin to change. It was 11 o'clock and time to turn in for the night. The fire was burning out now, only a few inches tall as Joe prepped his sleeping bag and his pillow in his tent. As he came out to finish putting out the campfire, he then heard 4 loud crashing knocks in the woods. Bam, 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 bam! The knocks were short, loud, and fast. What in the world was that, Joe thought as he began having second thoughts about putting out the campfire. Confused, he sat there for a few minutes, listening to the dark forest around him, wondering if someone else was out there. "Is anybody out there?" Joe casually called out into the night. No response. He shrugged it off. Maybe 10 minutes after the first, he heard a second set of crashing tree knocks. Bam, bam, bam! At this point, Joe decided to throw some more logs on the fire since this sound was too alarming to shrug it off and go to sleep. Then as he sat out at the fire, every few minutes he'd hear another powerful set of knocks. Bam, bam, bam! Followed by complete and total silence. How could anyone else be out here, he thought to himself while he continued to look around the woods to give him some peace of mind as to what could be making these sounds. Sounds a lifelong outdoorsman like Joe had never heard before. 30 minutes later, as Joe's nerves had begun to calm down, his fire still burning, he went back inside his tent to try to fall asleep. And then moments after entering his tent, he heard a large branch forcefully ripped off a tree in the woods to the left of his tent, around 50 yards away in the thick brush. Something was now moving in the woods to the left side as he could hear branches being stepped on and broken on the ground, the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the woods towards his camp. It must be a bear, Joe thought to himself, giving him a slight sigh of relief. Having spent his life out here, he's come across Adirondack black bears dozens of times in his life. He was comforted by the thought of something familiar. The movement in the woods, however, continued, moving closer and closer to the camp. Whatever it was not being quiet. Joe left his tent again and threw the last of his logs onto the fire to build it back up. He knew the bear would likely go away soon. The forest was too thick out here to see more than 20 or 30 feet in any direction, so he couldn't get a glimpse of the bear. But as he shined his flashlight into the darkness, a darkness so black you could cut it with a knife, he saw movement between the trees. A large, dark, shadowy figure, way bigger than a bear, moving from one tree to another tree to the left of his tent next to the river. What is that? My brain must be playing tricks on me, he thought. Bears aren't that size and they don't move like that, he told himself. I must be imagining it. Though he knew deep down it was no imagination. Time began to pass, maybe 30 minutes or so, and his fire began to burn out. Joe sat in his camping chair and didn't hear any more movement in the woods. He figured it must have been a bear, and the bear's gone now. So at this point, he decided to let his fire burn out on its own, and he went back inside his tent to catch some sleep. It was a long day getting this deep into the mountains, and has been a long night now, too, dealing with these sounds and what he assumes is just a pesky bear. Moments later, just as he began dozing off, he could see small pebbles hitting the fabric of his tent. Small stones the size of a nickel or a quarter, one by one, every few seconds, began hitting his tent. He could hear the sounds of the stone bouncing off his tent and landing on the forest floor, clanking against the other rocks and the dirt around. And this lasted for a couple of minutes, and then it stopped. At this point, Joe decided it must have been pine cones falling off the trees from above his tent, though he also knew there weren't any trees directly above his tent. Time passed, and he finally fell asleep and slept soundly until the morning. Once the sun came up and the sounds of the Adirondack loons cried, Joe woke up and began his usual morning routine when camping, starting with the only thing most people think about upon waking up: coffee. He unzipped his tent and stepped out into the beautiful summer sun and made some instant coffee. After all, he was camping. The weather was perfect as the sun rose to the east over the high peaks, a comfortable 70 degrees and not a cloud in the sky. As he drank his coffee, he thought to himself, what was that last night? That was strange. But now the sun was up and it was a beautiful day and he was out here to do some fishing, so that was exactly what he did. He put on his waders and boots, grabbed his fly fishing pole, and walked into the river to begin the day. He wasn't catching any fish near his campsite, though, so he made his way along the river slightly and tried his luck further up. Despite having next to no luck with the trout today, only catching sunfish after sunfish, he came back to his campsite around 3 o'clock. Of course, while he was out in the water, the events of last night were just a distant memory, only to come back to him once he returned to camp. Now, as he was back at camp, he ate some food, rolled up cheese and roast beef from the deli. As he finished his lunch, he began gathering more firewood around the camp, since he burned everything he gathered the night before. And it was at this point the memory of the previous night came back to him. So he collected double the amount of wood that he did the night before, just to have it along with more birch bark for good burning. After accumulating all the wood both he and even the next person camping at this spot would ever need, he sat in his chair and relaxed, pondering the night before, thinking about those tree knocks and how hard and how powerful they were. Maybe someone else is camping out in this area, he thought to himself out loud. So, Joe decided to walk to the top of the ridge where he heard a lot of the noise coming from to see if there's any signs of other people out here. And once he made it up the ridge, cut and scraped up from the thick trees everywhere, it was clear nobody else was out here or even could camp anywhere near him. His campsite was the only clear area for miles. So he made his way down the ridge back to the campsite and came up with a plan to keep the bear away. The bear, he was sure, visited him last night. He began spraying the perimeter of his camp with bug spray in an effort to mark his territory. Black bears don't tend to enjoy strong scents or perfumes. It's a great technique to keep them away from your camp. So he sprayed the trees and the ground in a big circle around his camp as far as 75 yards from his tent. This should do the trick, he thought to himself. It was 7 o'clock now, and the sun was still shining high in the sky, as it tends to do this time of year. So Joe decided to try his luck fishing again and hoped to pull out some nice-sized trout for dinner. So he suited back up in his chest-high black waders and boots, walked into the river, maybe 30 yards up from his camp, began fishing. And like earlier in the day, luck was not on his side and he didn't pull in any trout. No sunfish either this time around. It was now approaching 9 o'clock and he began the same routine as he did the night before. He built his fire and began cooking dinner again. Hot dogs, 2 sticks, roasting 2 dogs at a time. A true pro technique. And while he was cooking, he was listening to the woods to hear any wildlife coming in towards his camp. Perhaps it was the smell of the hot dogs that brought the bear in last night, he wondered. Though having done this hundreds of times in the past, he didn't think anything of it. Hours passed and it was just after 11 o'clock now. The sounds of the forest after dark was upon him. Coyotes in the distance, the occasional owl, and crickets in his campfire burning steadily made up the soundtrack of the evening. Joe thought the night was winding down, but as it would turn out, the night was just getting started. As he stood over his fire, moments before he planned to go into his tent and go to sleep, he heard it again. Bam, 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 bam! This time the knocks were even louder, faster, and more powerful than last night. Oh, not again, Joe nervously thought to himself. What is going on here? And the same as last night, he would hear a tree knock and then the woods would become dead silent. And then 5 minutes later, another set of knocks. Bam, bam, bam! Followed by nothing but the sound of his campfire. So Joe threw more wood on the fire again, and like last night, 30 minutes later, branches were being broken off the trees again. Except this time it was multiple branches and they sounded even bigger and closer. It was all happening. At this point, Joe is beginning to feel scared as this sort of activity is nothing he's ever experienced in his lifetime, and he knows this isn't a bear. And in a nervous effort to scare off whatever was breaking those huge branches and these loud knocks, Joe called out into the woods. Hello? Hello? Is someone there? Silence. He built up the fire as it was all he could do to keep him busy and give his brain moments of relief from the unknown lurking in the bush around his campsite for the second straight night. Fear was taking over as Joe continued to build the fire bigger and bigger, thus allowing him to see further into the forest around the perimeter of his campsite. Though, of course, with the thick brush surrounding the camp, it was a losing battle. The movement in the woods continued. Whatever it was began pacing from side to side along his camp.